Hello, everyone. I'm Ellen Shutt, Communications Director with GoEd, and I'm here today with Dr. Jay Udani, who's the founder and CEO of Medicus Research. He's also a board-certified internist and has developed and been involved with hundreds of clinical trials. So welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So we're here today to talk about the recent study that linked omega-3s with an increased risk of prostate cancer. And Dr. Udani is actually an interesting person to have this conversation with because of his background, and I'm going to ask him to share a little bit of that with you.
So, as you mentioned, I'm an internist, and we've run many clinical trials, and in my time as a clinical trial investigator, I was also one of the investigators in the SELECT study, which is the clinical trial upon which the data for this paper was extracted. So in fact, my patients were part of this particular cohort, and so I was very familiar with the original protocol, involved in recruiting and enrolling patients in there, and so I take a special interest in evaluating the methodology of this particular paper and comparing it to the original design of the study and the original intent of the study.
And having said that, I know you have a lot of opinions about what the issues are with this paper, so I definitely would ask you to please share them.
So, this paper looks at fatty acid and prostate cancer risk. Now, the study itself was looking at prostate cancer risk, but it was not related to originally about fatty acids or fish oil or even fish intake. It was related to other nutrients. And there are others who have discussed some of the high-level concerns about a study which is, and reporting on results which are not part of the original intent or design of the study. But I'm going to focus on some of the details by which the investigators of this and authors of this paper proceeded, and how I believe that that's problematic in coming up with some of the results that they did. So the first thing that I will mention is that there's a, excuse my notes here, there were a lot of there are a lot of statements about which subjects were included in this particular analysis. And one of the things that they mention is that the original cohort of that they analyzed the samples for was limited by, as they say in here, essentially the cost of running these samples, which means, it says on page 2, because of the high cost of phospholipid fatty acid assays, only the case subjects diagnosed through 2007 and their corresponding cohort were planned for this analysis, which means already they have modified the original design intent by saying, well, we're only going to select a smaller subgroup to look at because of cost concerns. And that's the real world, that's fine, but it also means that there's a selection bias in there. And this study started in 2001, and that's important because men were enrolled between 2001 and 2004. And the first prostate cancer incidents were started to be recorded in 2005, at least according to the ones that were included in this particular paper. And then they stopped including people until 2009, and yet the study went on until 2011. So one of the first things that you see here is that the study ran from 2001 to 2011, but the original design of this cohort analysis was only 2005 to 2009. Then on page 2, top of the second column, they say that, oh, well, there were also 75 additional men who were diagnosed with this high-grade prostate cancer in years 8 and 9 of the trial, so 2010, 2011, who were included in the overall analyses that are reported here, and yet their cohorts were not included in the analysis. And the cohort means that you take somebody, so this is a large study, it's 35,000 individuals. Obviously, due to cost constraints, you can't maybe do testing on all 35,000, that's fine. So they said, okay, we found, the first, we found X number of men who had prostate cancer, 834 men who had prostate cancer within this time window, and they with the low grade, and then 684 with the higher, or with the low, I'm sorry, that was a high grade, then the low grade, and then they added 156 additional men. They really, jumbled a lot of the way in which they included people, so it wasn't clean. It wasn't planned from the beginning that they were going to start here, look at these men, have their cohort, and do this. It's like they started something and said, oh, we found something, let's add on some more people here, and let's add on some more people here. And that makes a really messy analysis and makes it unreliable. The other thing to consider is that, already you've got this 2005 to 2009, then you add these other people on, but the blood that they analyzed was from their original enrollment into the study. Now, enrollment was from 2001 to 2004. And as I said before, I was involved in enrolling subjects in this study, and we collected blood on them. And it was that original enrollment blood which was looked at for this study. So if I look at the dates, it is theoretically possible that somebody could have been enrolled in 2001, had their blood drawn in 2001, and in 2011 could have been diagnosed with prostate cancer, which is a 10-year gap, and yet they would have looked at their blood from 2001 and made associations based on that. So at no point in this study did they ever try to tie the length of time between the initial blood value and the diagnosis of cancer. And there's so much of this, that, and I don't want to go, and bore the listeners here with more of it, but, when they say that there were no, where they didn't initially include the data from 2009 to 2011, they also subsequently say that that particular gap of time accounted for 54,000 person years, and yet they chose not to include it. So this is really problematic in that, I don't believe that they went hunting for something, but they were certainly not clean and neat in the way that they put all this together from the beginning. So it's, the cohort issue is also problematic because now you've tried to match people. So this is touted as part of a very large study, 35,000 men, which sounds very impressive. But when you get down to the ones who are included in this study, it's really 2,273 men only. So that is the people who got prostate cancer in their matched cohort. And what they tried to do in a matched cohort is they tried to say, okay, let me find men who have a similar ethnic background, and they had separated African American versus non-African American, and they tried to stratify cohorts according to age and basically age and race. So they're only including 2,000 people out of the 35,000, and yet they're making the conclusions that, in general, according to the whole population, it would be these sort of results. So that's already, again, part of the structural concern that I have with this study. So that's sort of the setup that I look here and say that there's a lot of issues. When I come back to the concern about when the blood was drawn and trying to make any sort of association between longitudinal blood draws and now, you have no data reported here anyway on what their dietary intake was, whether they were taking any sort of supplementation at all, whether it's omega-3 or other sorts of dietary supplements. And if you have no input on that at the beginning of the study, there's also no input on that as the study went on. So, for example, did people who start in this study and they know that they're on a study for prostate cancer, did enrollment in the study itself influence their behaviors once they were on the study? That is something that's not addressed here at all. Did they start taking more fish oil? Did they start taking less? Did they start doing more lifestyle things that would reduce their chance or increase their chance? We have no idea at all what happened to these men anywhere between 1 and 10 years from the time the blood was drawn to the time the diagnosis was made. And now we're asked to make these leaps of faith and association. So that's what I look at structurally. When I look at the findings in the study, One of the first set of findings is not even related to the fatty acids, but looking at the men who are in fact found to have prostate cancer compared to those who don't. And it says, again, the first paragraph of the results, those who had low and high-grade prostate cancer were more educated, had a higher PSA score, and had a larger proportion of first-degree relatives with a history of prostate cancer compared with non-cases. So you already have two well-known risk factors that are associated with prostate cancer. So it's the high PSA and then the first-degree relative. And as others have said, I'm not the first to say this, as they were more educated, is it possible that they were looking at things like fish or fish oil, omega-3s, as a hedge against their known higher risk for prostate cancer to begin with? Or, even if you wipe out the high PSA and the first-degree relative issue, the fact that one is more educated is associated with higher degrees of supplementation, of healthier food choices, of other lifestyle choices that may or may not be associated with prostate cancer. So there's a lot of already variables identified which could account for the increasing rate in this particular case versus non-case. And again, I want to go back that when you're talking about this case-match sub-cohort, you're not talking about the entire SELECT study. You're only talking about these 2,000 men who are part of this subset, and we have no idea what's happened to the other 31,000 or 33,000 men. I mean, there's so many variables out there that are not there. So let's look at the data now. There are two sets of tables to look at. The first is Table 2, which is the distribution of fatty acids among the participants, and comparing again within that small cohort those that did not get diagnosed with cancer within the time frame and those that did. And by the way, one other thing that I can't even figure out in page 2, top of the second column, it says here, by the way, 29 men in the sub-cohort, meaning the people that were supposed to be the controls, also got prostate cancer, and that sort of just washed over and never talked about again. So I don't even know what happened to them or how they accounted for them. So going back to this distribution, Table 2, I'm going to focus my comments primarily on EPA and DHA, as those are the two most commonly known long-chain fatty acids that your listeners might be familiar with. And if you look at total, EPA, DPA, and DHA, and you look at EPA, well, let's just look at EPA first. The mean for those with no cancer as a percentage of total fatty acids is 0.61, and those who got cancer was 0.65, and it was statistically significantly different, but we're talking about a difference of 0.03%. Now, both of these values are well within the normal ranges. So if you went to your doctor and got your omega, indices tested, you would find you could be at either of those ranges, and your physician would say that's great. You're within the normal range. That's fine. The fact that it's 0.03% higher in one versus the other has no clinical meaning, even though it has a statistical meaning here. And the same is with the DHA, 2.91 in the no cancer group to 3.01 in the cancer, so it's 0.1%. And again, just to give a reference, I've found some references on normal ranges of DHA, for example, to be 2.5 to 3.4. So we're well within almost the mean of what would be expected as the normal range for DHA, and yet this 0.1% somehow we're led to believe that is making a difference somehow in the overall. So this is all associated data, but certainly not causative. There's nothing here that shows me causative data. The other thing to keep in mind about these percentages, and it's based on the limitations of the study, and that's fine, is that this represents circulating fatty acids and not tissue fatty acids. A large degree of a body's fatty acid content is in fact located within the tissues, obviously fatty tissues and brain and other things. So we have no idea what the total body content is of these. We're only referring to circulating levels of the fatty acids at this time. And there's always, you know, a conversation of, does it represent absorption issues? Does it represent this? And of course, in this, as this was a single point in time, 10 years potentially before they were diagnosed with prostate cancer, you have no idea what they ate before they came in. Did they have fish on their way in? Did they have fish the day before? Did they take supplements? Did they take other forms of omega supplementation? You know, within that day, there's no documentation of that, so we have no way of knowing. And the last thing I'd like to talk about is just briefly the hazard ratios and looking at you know, the quartiles of the omega values and trying to show that compared to those in the lowest quartile as the reference, that as you increase your level of omega-3, that perhaps somehow you're increasing significantly your overall risk. Again, you know, there's a muddiness here as it relates to who is the cohort. Does that cohort accurately represent the population? Why did those certain individuals get prostate cancer? Should they have been included? But there's no smoking gun here at all saying it was this value which in fact caused this. This is all associated data, and as I mentioned, you know, several other issues with this. So, you know, statistically, I could go on for days talking about this, but I don't think you want to hear about that. So, you know, I think that my overall response to this is that there are a lot of structural inconsistencies in the selection of the subjects for the particular analysis that are driven by, again, real-world issues related to cost and availability of these things. In other words, they didn't go and draw additional blood when people got prostate cancer because this was not part of the planned analysis. This study was an intervention study of two other you know, vitamin mineral type ingredients. It was the vitamin E and selenium. And so they didn't anticipate that they were going to have to be looking at fish oil or other things. In the protocol, they did say that they would be open to evaluating other nutrients, so they were within the confines of the protocol in their right to do this, but they are overstating by not looking, especially at the time sequence between the blood draw and the onset of that, by not including a cohort of these additional 75 men who suddenly appear at the end of the study between the last 2 years, and you know, trying to make you know, smoking gun allegations about that it was this that caused it when they themselves said that these people already had higher PSAs and had first-degree relatives with a history of prostate cancer.
So I think I know the answer to this question, but if someone asked you to analyze this data and come up with some conclusions on the connection between omega-3s and prostate cancer, would you feel like you could do that with any validity?
I don't believe that I could. You know, I think that there are things that could be done to, especially looking at the time course issue and saying, you know, then it's interesting that, okay, it's not just quartiles of the level, but how long was, I mean, there's so much missing information from here that I would have a hard time doing that. I, of course, would enjoy doing that because we enjoy playing with data, but I don't think that we would find the same sort of results because we would be more stringent in what we would be specifically looking at. And most importantly, this is not a prospective study. This is looking backwards and saying, okay, an event happened, now let me go back in time and try to guess which one of these 100 factors might have been associated with that particular event, but never having the opportunity to connect the dots together because I don't have blood from the time that they were diagnosed.
Okay, one last question. So put on your doctor hat for a moment and just speculate on what you think might be the impact of this single study on what physicians are or will be comfortable recommending to their patients.
Question. I think that you know, it adds to a form of confusion that exists. On the other hand, I think that the decades of data on the cardiovascular benefits of fish oil are really the primary reason for recommendation. Now that there are prescription fish oil products, physicians are using them in the context of their FDA-approved indications, and this does not impact that at all. As far as generalized fish oil recommendations from physicians, I don't think that they were recommending it for prostate cancer prevention, so I don't think that this will impact that to begin with.
Well, Dr. Udani, thank you very much. This is really, really interesting information, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you.